Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, thank you for your participations on the scientific conference dedicated to the issue of the contemporary left. But before we start, I would like to thank the members of our program and the organizational board, above all our colleague Irena Ristić, who has invested immense efforts into gathering us here and creating a program for us to discuss in the next 2 days. Thank you, Irena, and we are appreciated very much. At the beginning, this short address, respecting the principle of amicus Plato, sed magis amica veritas, let me remind you of the fact that the Institute of Social Science was founded by the communist leftists with the aim of studying the society and educating university cadres for a new socialist society which, as it seemed at that moment, had no alternative. At the time, the Institute, dubbed the Red Academy, was supposed to ideologize social science and contribute to the strengthening of the communist paradigm. Nevertheless, 7 years after its founding, a serious critique of the communist state was written in the Institute. Andrija Krešić, who was the head of the Institute Department of Philosophy, wrote the book Political Society and Political Mythology, Contributions to the Critique of the Cult of Personality. This manuscript, which was in a way subversive but rather a reforming critique of communism, was censored and published only 4 years later in 1968. Several members of the Praxis School of Philosophy worked at the Institute, and for decades, topics of interest for the reform of the Marxist left were studied after the end of history, whose ideologists disregarded the fact that not everything that seems finished has actually finished. Research was focused on the issues of transitions. Now, in the second decade of the 21st century, we are obsessed with the studying of real politics of equal opportunities, abstract individualism, and competitiveness as values that are crucial for our digitalized global reality. This type of research is dominant in contemporary social sciences, based on the arrogant practice of the contemporary liberal state, which are interested in changes and alternatives, as one might have expected, put on their agenda the questions of what the use of social sciences, digital revolution, and the expanding technological achievements as the dominant features of the contemporary liberal capitalism have masked the need for critical research of our reality. Under such circumstances, contemporary liberalism, very much like Marxism earlier, disregarded the fact that progress requires the existence of competitive ideas and the integrity of the freedom of thought. For this reason, liberal theory failed to properly explain what was wrong in the abstract humanism of the Marxist philosophy, or in the concept of the equality as a value in itself, or on the phenomenon of progress in a social state. It was clearly explained what was totalitarian and vulgarized in the communist states. Not a difficult task, because with its realpolitik, it became an antithesis of civilization's values. But it never fully explained what would the prospect of global capitalism be if the very notion of the welfare state were deconstructed. And a couple of weeks ago, several hundred meters away from here, at the Academy of Science, an international conference of human rights in the 21st century was held. And one of the participants at this gathering was an eminent American lawyer, Ben Ferencz, who was a judge at the Nuremberg process. And he asked the question of whether human rights stand a chance in today's world. And after that, the discussion was dominated by topics concerning workers' rights in corporations and ethical aspects of the third generation's rights, solidarity rights. The conference was dominated by topics of crucial importance for the contemporary liberalism, but all of them were also significant for the left. In today's world, no reasonable person contends the fact that liberalism has achieved what Ricardo had set as the question of progress, what the causes of the wealth of nations are. The quality of life was improved, standard of living is higher in most states. But what is questionable is the fact that social differences have never been larger and obstacle to freedom never more pronounced. Without an alternative, liberalism and the triad of its values, freedom, equality, and private property, reconceptualized the hierarchy in which not all social values have equal value, because the primacy of property over freedom and equality is obvious. The question is being asked more often than ever. How long will progress in the world last without an alternative? Another one follows. Does progress require the development of new paradigm parallel with the liberal ideology? Many tend to call these notions contemporary utopias. 1 year ago, when I pitched the idea for today's gathering to my colleagues, some of them asked the question worth serious consideration. Who needs the left today? The answer, although rather open to attack, but was the only possible and logical. In the conditions of real politics, characterized by inter alia populism, xenophobia, tendency of a growing number of permanently unemployable people due to the uncontrolled technological development, with regional crises becoming the sources of the suffering of millions of people, it is our duty as scientists to discuss alternatives. The main reasons by social science to the challenges to the contemporary world are ideas. The history of political ideas teaches us that only some ideas stand a chance of influencing social change. For this reason, I see the purpose of this gathering in looking for changes and values based on liberal traditions, which, when confined and limited by a lack of alternatives, become their own antipode because they are generating equality and threaten freedom. Is the left idea the idea of progress? I don't know. Historically, the radical left has proved itself unworthy of the idea of progress, and this is why a discussion of the values within the left requires special attention, considerations, and dialogue. The second reason why I believe that our discussion today is to the point is the fact that contemporary liberalism responds to crisis in the contravention of the substantial development, and that some isolated alternative response to crisis have initial result and offer hope. The two different responses to similar crises in Greece and Portugal are cases that offer lessons to be learned. And yet they have remained unresearched in the shadow of the Brexit, Crimean and migrant crisis. And last but not the least, I hope the dialogue in this gathering will be good and that it will encourage consideration of alternatives and different circumstances so that we can truly free. Thank you very much for your attention, and I ask Mr. Brändle to...
Yes, good morning everybody and welcome to our conference, dear Goran Bašić, dear Irena Ristić, ladies and gentlemen. It's also my pleasure to welcome you to our conference on changes and challenges of the left in contemporary Europe. The left is dead, long live the left, question mark. My name is Max Brändle. I'm director of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung here in the Belgrade office. Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is a German political foundation dedicated to the development of democracy, of social democracy especially. I'm quite new in Belgrade and I'm happy that I can start the cooperation with your institute with this conference today. I've been in Berlin and then in Zagreb for the last 4 years, and some of the participants I also know already from these discussions. So I'm happy to be here and I'm looking forward to my time and to our discussions today. We are witnessing a crisis of the left, and from my perspective also a crisis of social democratic parties in Europe today, and it is indeed worrying to us and to me. And great forces are at play. Goran Bašić has already mentioned the circumstances. Globalization as the first thing to name, the vast increase of financial streams of production around the planet, of the transport of goods around the globe. It has increased inequalities within our societies here in Europe, we can say. And while some are winning on this development, there's a lot of losers that are being produced. Digitalization is threatening to be another driver of inequality, and the use of IT technologies in many places, in many parts of our work environments, of our society, as well as a further and novel way of automatization of production. It might also lead to great leaps forward in productivity and gains in profit, but while some will certainly profit from this, it also at least threatens a large number of those employed and working to be the losers of this development, and again, it's a driver of inequality. We're seeing that migration, as a consequence of violence and war, and also of climate change, has been increasing, and it poses challenges to the Western European societies, and labor migration and the exodus of a lot of those that seek their chances in other parts of the continent are posing increasing challenges for the societies from where they are leaving from. This increases the inequalities between and the economic differences between our countries and national economies. These are just a couple of maybe the most important ones that I can see, but globalization, digitalization, migration, climate change, they pose a lot of challenges for our societies and politics and political actors today, and they are part of the scenery that the left and we all are faced with. And as a social democrat, it seems obvious to me that these challenges can only be addressed in an international cooperation and with international solidarity, and that the left should have answers to provide to these challenges. The countries in Europe are all small. Europe is made up of small countries and those that have not really understood that they are small yet. So there has to be an international approach and international cooperation, and no country, and certainly also not Germany alone or anybody, could face these challenges alone. But we have to see that the political actors on the left are losing ground, and that voters, especially employees and workers, are turning away from left parties and left politics and social democrats. That's kind of hard to understand from the point of view that I have been spelling out before, and we have to address this issue and try to understand it. So if you look at these forces that I have been trying to describe, and you look at the answers that the populist and right-wing parties provide that these voters are turning to, you might be puzzled, because it is not on the national level that you can find answers, but that's what's being promised. And the provision of ideas of a cultural identity, which are presented as a protection from these forces, from my perspective, cannot work. But this seems to be a very successful way of organizing political parties and political actors on the right. So while the issues of the left are pressing, is the left dead? And while the answers should be provided by the left, we can ask, long live the left, question mark. So I'm really happy that we are organizing this conference together, and that you, Irena and Goran Bašić, have been putting this conference together over the last course of the year, and that we can discuss these issues and maybe clarify some of the issues and move a little bit forward. So I hope you'll all have an interesting exchange. I'm looking forward to your presentations and the discussions, and hope to learn a lot, and I hope we'll all have an interesting conference. Thank you.
Okay. Let me close this introduction in a way without knowing what Goran and Max would say. It is somehow fitting very well because Goran started with a rather wide picture of contemporary problems in the widest sense. Max then narrowed it down a bit to what are the challenges and named a couple of them. And I will maybe then, as I prepared here, start or go into even into more details regarding this conference and the issues we will deal here. When starting to deal with this topic and the concept of this conference, one seemed from the literature very clear and without any doubts that the left is facing a crisis, and with also the Social Democrat parties as its main carriers in post-war Europe. Maybe even their biggest crisis since '45. But what rather seemed not so convincing in the literature, and we have seen it, was that this crisis goes back to the global financial crisis, so basically 1 decade ago, and this was not very compelling. And indeed, when we started to dig deeper and using a wider time frame, we only not revealed more layers of the crisis, but also a very complex historical context. And all this kept on opening new sets of questions that we had to deal, or that we wanted to deal with. Starting from the issue of the end of the economic boom in the 70s to the introduction of the first, let's say, what we today call neoliberal policies by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, to the collapse of the Soviet Union and what kind of long-term consequences this had for the left, which back then did not seem so obvious at all. Then we had the alleged triumph of the liberalism and the so-called end of history that also now, from after 20 or 30 years ago, we look much differently at. And all these other measures that were taken, like the deregulation of the labor market, of the financial markets, and the deregulation of the media, and so on. But when thinking of all this and when digging into all these problems, I had the question at one point thinking, if the crisis really goes back to so many causes from 30 or 40 years ago, can we really talk about a crisis? And can we really say it is something that can be put into this term of crisis, or whether we should more address, given that it lasts for quite a long time now, all these problems, whether we have to think more of some deeper structural problems that the left is having for these decades now, and that turns the left into a status of permanent crisis. And what is it that we have to grasp when we think of more something that is a structural problem and not something that we can attach to one or two events that happened recently. The concept of this conference followed the aim to provide a framework for understanding patterns and institutional, socio-economical, and historical causes of the challenges which the left is facing in contemporary Europe today. Given the global financial crisis was not sufficient as an explanatory factor for the downfall of the European left and its ideas, we wanted to look for these additional explanations based on economic transformation and the failure of the third way. Related to all this, the question of the responsibility of political elites, which have taken very firm decisions regarding all these processes in the last 2 or 3 decades, like reducing the social welfare state and protecting the free trade, ushering this way a regime of deregulation, privatization, and fiscal austerity, and creating what Thomas Piketty defined as a multiple elite party system. What, at least to me, seemed encouraging is that scholars who are obviously passionate about this topic and the ideas of the left, that they are nevertheless not ready to put the blame simply on external and, let's call them, objective causes like the crisis, like the financial crisis, but most recently the migration crisis, and other things and events that happened. On the contrary, these scholars clearly identified the responsibility of the left, and just to mention one of them, Chantal Mouffe, for example, in her most recent book, in fact, spares Europe's social democrats nothing, calling them, quote, prisoners of their post-political dogmas and reluctant to admit their mistakes. She said that the social democrats cannot recognize that many of the demands articulated today by right-wing populists are democratic demands to which a progressive and leftist answer, or at least an alternative, must be given. Like many other authors, she is not only, in this example that I just gave, looking back to the failures and the responsibility of the left parties, but also opening more questions that are now very in contemporary Europe, not only for the left, but for all societies in Europe on the table, and in which also the left will have to position itself sooner or later. I know, and I don't have, I'm not having so much illusions that in this conference we will really have the possibility to answer all these questions and to go into it. But I hope that we have created partly a framework in which we will be having inspiring discussions and presentations that will at least make it possible to tackle some of these causes that we identified as some main drivers of the crisis of the left. Finally, let me say that it was an immense challenge, but also very rewarding and fulfilling to organize and conceptualize this conference. It also included identifying all of you and reading a lot of your papers and publications, and this has also enriched me. At this point, I would like to express a few words of gratitude to some persons and institutions. First, I would like to thank the director of our institute, Goran Bašić, who at the beginning of this year approached me with this idea for this conference, believing that it is a topic worth scrutinizing. Then things, I would say, in a positive way, got a bit out of control, and I took over much more maybe than Goran wanted or intended to. At the same time, I think that it was mutual with him withdrawing and letting me do things, and I think it was a great amount of trust that he gave to me, and I'm thankful for this. I hope you will not disappoint him, since you were my, in a way, my choice. At the same time, I owe the same gratitude to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Belgrade, who was not only ready to cooperate with us on this conference, but was also showing full commitment and devotion to make this happen, and to, especially in moments when we were on crossroads, to make decisions and help us with making them. So thank you, Bojan, for this, and thank you, Max, for the support and the cooperation. Of course, no conference is a conference without the participants, and it was really a pleasure to get in touch with all of you and to organize everything, to define the topics, and I'm grateful that you accepted to come, and that you are here now in Belgrade. With great regret, we had 2 cancellations in the last minutes. One was from Heikki Patomäki from the University of Helsinki, with whom I arranged his presentation already in June this year. He was one of the first to accept and to organize everything, and he would have been probably one of only a few that would feel like at home with this weather here. But unfortunately, he was riding his bike in snowy Helsinki and fell and hurt his knee, so he had a ban from his doctor to travel and to come. Also, our colleagues from the Pantheon University in Athens, Ioannis Balabanidis and Katerina Labrinou, had to cancel last night their arrival due to a serious infection of their daughter. We will try to, at least with the 2 of them, since they are tomorrow, their presentation will be tomorrow, that we might, they already sent their presentations 2 days ago, that we might have them through Skype presenting at least the PowerPoint presentation. Last but not least, of course, I would like to thank our staff here who did a remarkable work and made this conference happen. Vesna Jovanovic, Emma Vukojic, and Svetlana Injic were always a great support and extremely operational. They are now outside, but I will pass on the gratitude to them as well. So thank you again for coming, and I hope we will have a good conference.